So first of all, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. We're very excited for our speaker tonight. We're very honored that he has joined us. My name is Emily Corbett Chadwick. I'm the current chair of PS21, and we'll be presenting this evening Dr. Ed Cameron as part of a series that we're calling Paris to Portsmouth, Taking Action on Climate Change. For anyone who is joining us this evening and is unfamiliar with PS21, Portsmouth Smart Growth for the 21st Century is an independent, volunteer-led nonprofit that presents ideas and encourages discussion around planning issues in Portsmouth and the Seacoast. Our goal is really to support a vibrant, sustainable, livable community consistent with the principles of smart growth and the historic nature of Portsmouth within the context of the 21st century. You can find out more information about PS21. You can watch videos of our past events, and most importantly, you can make donations at ps21.info, and you can also follow PS21 on Facebook and on Twitter. PS21's next event will be the second part of our Paris to Portsmouth series, where we'll be focused on assembling a panel of municipal officials from other New England cities and here in Portsmouth to discuss efforts to reduce carbon, increase energy efficiency within the city, and that will be happening on May 22nd. PS21 is committed to keeping our events free and open to the public. We rely on the generosity of our sponsors to do this and your donations to bring internationally known speakers like Dr. Cameron to Portsmouth. So this evening we would especially like to thank our sponsors who made this event possible. The Piscataqua Garden Club, the Rosamond Thaxter Foundation, Revision Energy, and the Jeffrey E. Clark and Martha Fuller Clark Fund of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. We'd also like to thank our event partners, Corway Film Institute, 3S Artspace, Seacoast Media Group, GDI Design, and PortsmouthNH.com. The idea for this two-part series entitled Paris to Portsmouth was born out of the Portsmouth City Council voting to join 270 other cities in supporting the Paris Climate Agreement back in June 2017. We wanted to better understand the Paris Climate Agreement and what role cities like Portsmouth could play in upholding it. To set the framework and begin that conversation, Dr. Cameron is here to detail the goals and intentions of the agreement and set forth strategies for municipal involvement. Dr. Cameron, is a climate change advocate, analyst, and strategist with more than 20 years' experience working with governments and companies around the world to build a low-carbon and inclusive community. Dr. Cameron is also a senior advisor at BSR, a global nonprofit that works with companies and partners to build a just and sustainable world. So please help me to welcome Dr. Cameron. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much and good evening, everybody. I should say that if we speak to each other down here, I'm just Edward. But it took me 10 years to earn a PhD, and so I even make my mother call me Dr. Cameron when she calls me on the telephone. So when I'm up here, I'm Dr. Cameron. When I'm down there with you, it's Ed or Edward. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you this evening. I'm very grateful to the sponsors and to our hosts for convening what I hope will be a very rich and interactive conversation. And I want to stress the notion of it being interactive. I'm going to try and present information to you so that we have a common and shared foundation of knowledge. But at any point during the presentation, feel free to put up your hand if you require clarification of anything that's being said. And we have reserved ample amounts of time at the end of the presentation to have a discussion together. And I often find from these events that the true value comes from the discussion, from how you prompt me, from how you prompt your neighbors, and from how we interact with each other and try to tackle some of these very important issues as a community together. As a foundation, and I'm not going to bore you with my biography, but what I want to essentially say to you is that what you're going to hear tonight is the accumulation of 2 decades of experience. And some of that experience comes from failure, and some of that experience comes from success. Essentially, what I do is I design climate strategies for companies, how they can go about reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, how they can go about building resilience into their supply chains, and I help to shape global and national climate policies, the types of policies that catalyze action within communities, within companies, and right across the globe in the case of the Paris Agreement. What I've also tried to do, now that I live in New England, is to be an evangelist of climate action and to offer that expertise to communities all across the region to come to forums like this, for example, and speak about my experience. So I hope that you will take tonight's event as a stimulus for further action in your community and for action in your own lives going forward on this issue. Now, what I'm going to talk about this evening is essentially divided into 4 sections. I'm going to introduce to you the Paris Agreement to make sure that you understand how it was designed, what it contains, and what its implications are. And I'm going to draw your attention to the fact that the Paris Agreement is not just a multilateral environmental agreement. It's actually a global economic stimulus. So it is about economic development, and we will have the choice as to whether we want to be part of that economic development or not. We're then going to get political. We're going to talk about what the federal government in Washington, D.C. is doing about the issue of climate change. I'm going to present to you findings from scenario planning about the Trump administration that I conducted essentially from the morning after the election took place over the course of an 18-month period. And I'm going to reveal to you what is happening as a consequence of the initiatives, the personnel, the policy directions of the new administration in Washington. I'm then going to present to you a more optimistic vision of what's happening in the United States by revealing that we have leadership coming from new sources, notably leadership coming from the private sector, which is very important and also a very critical inflection point, because those of us who have worked on environment for a very long time might traditionally think of the private sector as being a barrier to ambition and action rather than a partner. And I'm going to tell you why I think that partnership is now emerging and how we can capitalize on it. And then finally, I'm going to suggest some strategic building blocks for how you design a municipal strategy that is Paris compliant. I'm not going to get tactical. I'm not going to go into the weeds because I don't know enough about Portsmouth to be able to give you specifics, but I'm going to try and give the strategic guidance using some anecdotes that I've picked up in conversation during the course of today. Now, so that we have a starting point and a common foundation on the issue of climate change, I always like to present to you some basic facts related to this issue. And I apologize in advance to those of you who participated in today's talk at the Portsmouth High School. There's about 2 or 3 slides of repetition and then the rest is new. And so there's about 5 to 7 minutes of stuff that you've heard before. So bear with me as I bring the rest of the audience up to date. What I always like to do is to characterize climate change as consisting of 3 related collision courses. The first collision course on the left-hand side of this slide is the way that human greenhouse gas pollution is changing the composition of the atmosphere and of the climate system. This is not something that's happening today and yesterday. This is something that dates back 10,000 years to the dawn of settled human civilization, when we first started changing the land for agricultural practices so that we could build settlements. But the changing of the climate system as a consequence of human-induced greenhouse gas pollution accelerated during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And in that 150-year period since the Industrial Revolution, we have changed the composition of the atmosphere at an accelerating rate. We now have greenhouse gas particles in the atmosphere unprecedented in the last 800,000 to 1 million years of life on Earth. And that is because of the way we use fossil fuels for energy, for transport, for industrial processes. It's because of the way we use land. It's because of our practices with deforestation. It's because of our practices with agriculture and our diets. So over the course of these past centuries, we have fundamentally altered the composition of the atmosphere. That is a proven scientific fact, and I will give you the basis of the science in just a moment. But the second collision course, which is important, is that this changing composition of the atmosphere has profound effects for socio-ecological system. So because the atmosphere is changing, we are experiencing a rise in global mean temperatures. We've already seen global mean temperatures rise by 1 degree Celsius since the last century began. We were on course before the Paris Agreement to 4.8 degrees Celsius of temperature rises. Now, to put that into context, at 2 degrees Celsius of temperature rises, the coral reef systems that are home to 25% of all marine life, they die. And they take that 25% of marine life with them. Once we get to 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the basic crops that we depend upon for our food security, maize and wheat and rice and corn, become untenable. And so once we get to 4 degrees Celsius of mean temperature global rises, we get to what the CEO of the largest insurance company in the world calls an uninsurable world. So global mean temperature is rising, and that has additional consequences. The first consequence is an increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, things like hurricanes and cyclones. If you follow the news, you will be aware that last year we witnessed the most costly and devastating Atlantic hurricane season in history. There were 5 hurricanes in a row within the space of a number of weeks, including one that went as far as Ireland, the furthest to the east hurricane ever to form in the Atlantic. And that caused billions of dollars of damage, and of course, it led to loss of jobs, loss of homes, and very specific human consequences, particularly in Florida. So we see an increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. Second thing we see is an increase in vector and waterborne diseases. Things like malaria, yellow fever, dengue fever, becoming more intense, becoming more resistant to the antibiotics and various drugs that we use to treat them, and moving into places that had not previously experienced these sorts of illnesses. In New England, one of the things that we see is the growing incidence of ticks and the Lyme's disease, of course, that is associated with ticks. And where I live in Manchester, Vermont, last summer, there were 10 phone calls per day to the medical center in a town of 2,000 people, talking specifically about ticks, requiring those antibiotics that eventually will become obsolete because we will develop strains of Lyme's disease that are resistant to those antibiotics. We see a change in precipitation. Those places that are already susceptible to drought experiencing more drought, those places that are susceptible to flooding experiencing more flooding. We see changes to water availability, particularly water that comes from glacial melt, a very, very significant issue in the Himalayas, where the Himalayan mountains feed into places like China and India. So you have not only water problems, you have geopolitical problems as it relates to control over water supplies. And of course, you see the changing composition of the oceans. You see rising sea levels having substantial effects for coastal systems. You see rising acidification of the oceans with substantial consequences for coral reef systems. Now, it's very important to understand in this second collision course that this is not just an environmental issue. This is a human issue, because humans depend on these ecosystems for jobs, for homes, for the sustenance of human rights, for issues related to mobility. We now see a rise in climate-induced involuntary displacement as a consequence of climate change. There is very sound research tying together the conflict in Syria with a drought that started in eastern Syria about 6 years ago. And we're seeing now more and more across the world conflicts related to natural resource scarcity arising from climate change. We see, for example, human rights being threatened by climate change. The right to food, the right to water, the right to development, the right to a minimum means of subsistence, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to health, the right to life itself. Everything, with the exception possibly of the right to marriage. I can't make an argument for why climate change affects that. But there are 52 internationally recognized human rights, and we can trace climate impacts to the undermining of many of those rights. Now, in all the years that I present climate change, the way that I tie together the socio-ecological issue and the poor and marginalized, which is the third collision course, is to draw your attention to one damning statistic. The third collision course talks about how the poor and the marginalized are hit first and hit hardest by this issue. And the example of this is in the country of Bangladesh, where 90% of all fatalities to extreme weather events like hurricanes and cyclones are women. Now, why on earth would 90% of the fatalities be women? Women and men are exposed to the same extreme event. The answer is that women cannot leave home without a male guardian. They have never been taught to swim. They have never been taught to climb a tree. They have no access to information, therefore they do not know when the storm is coming. They have no access to decision making, therefore their voice is not listened to when municipal resilience strategies are being developed. They have no access to property rights. They have no access to financial services, which means they cannot build a foundation of financial security that they can then draw upon when disaster strikes to rebuild their lives. And the truth of the matter is, if you look around the globe, you will find low-income populations, marginalized communities such as indigenous peoples, people of color, and women are disproportionately impacted by climate change because they don't have the basic resources to enable them to anticipate, avoid, absorb, and then recover from disaster. So this is not an environmental issue. This is an environmental issue that combines with intersecting social, cultural, political, and economic inequalities to amplify risk for individuals, for households, for communities, and for entire economies. And the lesson is, if we do not start treating this as a socio-ecological issue as opposed to merely an environmental issue, we will fail to properly understand the risk, and we will fail to properly put in place the right strategies for resilience. Now, all of this, of course, in addition to having impacts on lives, has substantial dollar implications as well. I'm not going to bore you with all of the statistics. What I want to explain, however, is that when we're talking about the economic implications of climate risk, we're not talking about millions of dollars. We're not even talking about billions of dollars. We're talking about trillions of dollars. The most recent research published on this issue, for example, suggests that up to $24 trillion of global assets are at risk as a consequence of climate change. In part, this is because of emerging economies like China having very heavily populated coastal regions where the bulk of their economy is situated. But $24 trillion is estimated of being at risk. When you put that into perspective, we have a global economy of between 70 and 90 trillion. If there was another issue that we were dealing with that had such significant economic consequences, you can bet your life that we would be on top of it right away. But we'll get on in a few moments as to why that is not the case with climate. Now, one of the things that always puzzles me as a European living in the United States for 10 years is why we continue to have a debate about science. Because in fact, the scientific underpinnings of climate change predate the toaster oven. We understood the fundamental workings of the climate system in the early 19th century. It was a scientist from Ireland, in fact, whose work was then built upon by a scientist from France, which was built upon again by a scientist from Sweden, and by the time we get into the mid-20th century, it's leading scientists from the United States who bring this issue to the forefront and who fundamentally understand this issue. We have, right now, tens of thousands of research projects and peer-reviewed research that all support a robust evidence base for this issue. And that evidence base tells us three things. First of all, that climate change is unequivocal. There is no doubt that it is happening. Second of all, that it is accelerating. It is getting worse and will continue to get worse the further that we delay action on this issue. And third, it is human-induced. It is not caused by solar flares. It is not caused by our proximity to the sun. It is not caused by volcanic eruptions or tectonic activities. It is a direct consequence of human use of fossil fuels and human use of land. Now, there has been a lot of investigations into the body of scientific evidence, and they always come to approximately the same conclusion. On average, 97% of all peer-reviewed published research on this issue supports what I have just said to you. And yet, if you turn on certain news channels in the United States, what you'll get is one person arguing against another one person, which gives you the impression that there is doubt and division within the scientific community. There is no doubt. If there was doubt, you would not have every country in the world and the research institutes within these countries, and even the major oil-producing companies of this world, accepting the scientific basis. So one of the things that we've got to do to demonstrate leadership is we've got to build from a foundation of shared facts. Then we can have legitimate debates about what we should do about those facts. Then we can have philosophical discussions about what the best way to approach the problem is. But we cannot have those legitimate philosophical, ideological, political discussions unless we start from a basis of common understanding of the facts. Now, that brings me to the Paris Agreement, now that we're all on the same page about the common basis. The Paris Agreement took approximately 25 years to create. It started as early as the late 1980s. The first President Bush signed something called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. And over the course of the following decades, negotiations at the global level happened at least 3 times a year, with major gatherings happening at the end of each year. And those were painstaking negotiations consisting of many steps forward and many, many steps back. But finally, in 2015, we came to the first significant universal agreement. There are 3 words that I want you to remember about this agreement, and we will dive in to a couple of these issues in just a second. But the 3 words I want you to walk away from this meeting tonight with are, first and foremost, unprecedented. The Paris Agreement is unprecedented because of the volume of participation. This is not a small number of industrialized countries moving ahead to reduce their emissions while everyone else gets a free pass. This is the global community working in unison, irrespective of historical responsibility, irrespective of capabilities, irrespective of wealth. It's all the countries of the world committing to act to the limit of their capabilities. It's also unprecedented in terms of the volume of ambition, the amount of greenhouse gases that we are going to avoid as a consequence of embarking on this common journey together. The second word that I want you to remember is that it is defining. It's not just an environmental agreement. It fundamentally reshapes the global economy away from a high-carbon economy towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient and inclusive economy. It does that with real policy, and it does that with real dollars. And then finally, it's immediate. This is not something that is being postponed to a later date. Immediately after Paris, the Chinese government went back to Beijing, and they immediately embedded their pledge into the 13th five-year plan. And all around the world, we see countries taking the commitments that they put on the table in Paris and transcribing those commitments into national law. So this is real, and it's happening before our very eyes. Now, to give you a sense of the notion of unprecedented, first and foremost, the image on the left-hand side gives you a sense of the volume of countries that are participating, but also importantly, the volume of emissions that are covered. This covers 98% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And what's also important about this figure of 96% is that these countries have not just signed the Paris Agreement, but they've also come forward with what are called national climate action plans. And within those national climate action plans, we have information as to what amount of greenhouse gases governments will address, what sectors that they will cover, transport and energy and industry and so on, and what dollars they're willing to mobilize in order to make this real. So very, very substantial. On the right-hand side, you have a graphic that is both optimistic and depressing all at once. You see on the right-hand side of the right-hand graphic that 196 countries around the world have agreed to stay the course with the Paris Agreement. Now, I want you to understand for a second that within those 196 countries, there is the theocracy of Saudi Arabia and Iran, there is the Communist Party of China, there's the Christian Democrats of Germany, there's the Conservatives of the UK, there were the Socialists of France. There is every feasible ideology on the political spectrum from extreme left to extreme right. This is not a liberal issue. Globally, this is a human issue. And it doesn't matter if you're a conservative, it doesn't matter if you're a liberal, it doesn't matter if you are a daughter of Thatcher or if you are a son of Charles de Gaulle. You are signing up to this because you know that the risk is high and the opportunity presented from a low-carbon economy is equally high. And then on the left-hand side, you have one country standing alone. Now, recently you had 3 countries over on that left-hand side. You had the United States, you had Guatemala, and you had Syria. Syria had not signed up to the Paris Agreement because it doesn't have a functioning government. Guatemala had not signed up to the Paris Agreement because it did not believe it was ambitious enough. Both of those governments recently signed up to the Paris Agreement, and as a consequence, the only country in the world that is now talking about withdrawing from the Paris Agreement is the United States of America. That is a dreadful position of isolation for the US government to be in. It is an abdication of leadership, and it is also something that undermines US credibility across a range of other international issues that are of vital importance strategically to this country. So we have an unprecedented agreement, but of course there is one outlier. Now, one of the myths that is also propagated, not just about the Paris Agreement, I think you probably will have heard the term that the Paris Agreement is, quote, a Chinese hoax. But you'll also hear a lot in the United States about the fact of why should we act when the Chinese are doing nothing? And what I want to do is simply dispel that myth that the Chinese are doing nothing. In fact, China is becoming the clean energy superpower of the 21st century. They're not doing that because we're asking them to do it. They're doing it in part because China is extremely vulnerable to climate change. Most of their water comes from Himalayan glacial melt. Most of their population and production facilities for their economy is located on coastal zone areas that are susceptible to sea level rise, storm surges, and extreme weather events. And the biggest threat to the Chinese Communist Party's hold on power is social and environmental unrest spreading in the streets. So they take the risk of climate change very seriously, and they have responded to that risk by putting in place unprecedented ambition domestically on climate change. So, for example, their National Climate Action Plan, as part of the Paris Agreement, commits to sourcing 20% of all of their energy from renewable sources by the end of the next decade. To put that into perspective, within the next 15 years, they will build energy infrastructure from renewable sources equivalent to all the electricity generation in the United States today. And in order to make that happen, they will mobilize the financial equivalent of the Marshall Plan, which reconstructed Europe after the Second World War. So they are serious about the issue, they are serious about the energy, and they are serious about the money that they are investing in it. And they're also reaping the rewards of all of this. Because you'll see from the other data points on this particular slide that they are creating very large volumes of high-paying, technically skilled jobs. You'll see that in 2015 alone, 1.8 million jobs were added in China in the renewable energy sector, as opposed to only 157,000 jobs in the United States. So one important question we have to ask ourselves is, why on earth would we want to cede the opportunity of creating the energy superpower of tomorrow to our geopolitical rivals? Why would we want to cede that opportunity to the second largest economy in the world rather than taking that opportunity for the largest economy in the world? This is the one and only complicated climate graphic that you'll see in the presentation tonight. But what I wanted to do was to give you a sense of the ambition in terms of emissions reductions that we have in the Paris Agreement. So before the agreement was reached, as I mentioned earlier, we were on course for 4.8 degrees Celsius temperature rises before the end of this century, an uninsurable world, some would say an uninhabitable world. As a consequence of the Paris Agreement, we are deviating from that trajectory. We're now on course for 2.8 to 3.2 degrees Celsius of temperature rises. Still far too high, still insufficient ambition, still much more work to be done. Because what the science tells us is that we need to hold temperature rises to 2 degrees Celsius or less, or even to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, one of the jobs that I've been lucky enough to have in my life was a senior advisor on climate change to the government of the Maldives. And the Maldives is one of the smallest nations in the world. It has a population of 300,000 people. It's located in the southern Indian Ocean between Sri Lanka and India. There are 1,200 islands, 200 of which are inhabited, and the highest point above sea level is 1 meter. At 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rises, we already begin to see effects on the two largest economies in that country. 50% of the economy and 50% of the jobs are dependent on coral reef systems because the two largest industries are tourism and fisheries. So already if we get to 1.5 degrees with the threat for coral reef systems, the sustainability of the Maldives for long-term habitation begins to dwindle. But if we get to 2 degrees Celsius of temperature rises, the sea level projection suggests that the country will disappear under the ocean. And 3,000 years of human civilization on those islands will disappear forever. So this is real. It's not just real for us here, it's real for vulnerable communities right around the globe. But for a moment, I want you to concentrate on this yellow wedge between where we were going and where we are now headed as a consequence of the Paris Agreement. And I want to translate that yellow wedge into economic opportunity, because I said earlier that the Paris Agreement is actually a global economic stimulus. An assessment has been made of all of the national climate action plans, and that assessment has concluded, and it's an assessment by the International Energy Agency, by the way, it's concluded that those national climate action plans contain $13.5 trillion in investments in clean energy in the next 15 years alone. Now, to put that into perspective, the assessment does not include the types of investments that will also go into transport and in industrial processes and land use changes and so on and so forth. So what you're talking about within those national climate action plans is trillions and trillions of dollars in the creation of a new global economy. So again, this is not a conversation just about risk. This is not a rescue mission for a doomed planet. This is the creation of an inclusive economic model that will benefit all of us if we seize the opportunity from the Paris Agreement rather than ignore it. The final two things I want to say about the Paris Agreement is that for those people, like, for example, the noted scientist at Middlebury in Vermont, Bill McKibben, who think that the Paris Agreement is insufficiently ambitious, the short answer to his critique is yes, it is in its current form. But the longer answer to his critique is that there is a design element baked into the Paris Agreement that solves that problem. And the design element is that every 5 years, governments are supposed to come back to the negotiation table and, quote, progressively increase their ambition. Backsliding is not allowed. So every 5 years, we have to come back and we have to propose more than we proposed the previous time. That provides governments with the opportunity to road test their climate action plans, to learn the lessons, to implement, and then to come back 5 years hence with more ambition. So the critique that this is not sufficient is a legitimate critique, but it doesn't take account of the full elements of the design of the Paris Agreement. And then as a segue into the next section of our conversation, what I really want to emphasize for those who criticize the Paris Agreement as being unfair on the United States is that the Paris Agreement was made in the United States. All of the design elements of the Paris Agreement, the fact that it is global, the fact that emerging economies and developing countries have to take on targets and not just industrialized countries, which was the critique of the Kyoto Protocol, you might all remember. The fact that there is finance being mobilized, the fact that every country gets to come forward and volunteer its own commitment as opposed to having it imposed by a global body. All of those were design elements prepared and advocated by the US government. In addition to that, the success of the agreement was based on the bilateral relationship between the US and China. They worked together behind the scenes on this issue for over 2 years. And it was not only the #1 area of prioritization for both governments, it was the #1 area of bilateral progress between the two countries. And when you think about all of the areas where the United States and China disagree on, whether it's human rights or the military posture in East Asia or issues related to cybersecurity, the fact that they could work together progressively, productively, and bring the rest of the world along with them was a major, major success. So this particular agreement secured all the US red lines in the negotiations, and the design elements were designed not only by the US federal government, but by state-level representatives, by think tanks and research institutes, civil society actors, and faith-based leaders in the United States advocating for this outcome. And then we had an election. And that election has changed things substantially, because we have a new administration, and as a consequence of that new administration, we have all manner of not only new policies, but new ways of talking about this particular issue. Now, the day after the election, I was approached by a US philanthropy and asked if I would develop some scenario planning about what a new administration might actually do on this particular issue. And the way in which we divided up the scenario planning was that first and foremost, we wanted to look at what a new administration might do on the issue of decarbonization. And what I mean by that is how would the real economy change as a consequence of changes in federal policy. Sometimes the real economy shifts irrespective of federal policy, so they're not always closely aligned. Second of all, we wanted to see how might global diplomacy change as a consequence of a new leadership in Washington, D.C. For example, would the rest of the global community remain committed to Paris, or would we begin to see other countries following in the US lead and themselves pulling out of the Paris Agreement? And then finally, we wanted to see what the implications would be for discourse and public reasoning. How would we talk about this issue going forward? How would we be allowed to talk about this issue going forward? How would what had been emerging as a growing consensus in the society about this issue be affected by new sound bites and new statements coming out of the White House? And we looked at two potential outcomes. The first outcome we called putting the brakes on. And what we meant by this was essentially a return to the years of George W. Bush. The George W. Bush administration was also quite hostile to climate action, but their hostility was quite sophisticated. They realized, for example, that there was a lot of political capital to lose if you were too vocal and if you were too intransigent about this issue. So they were very careful to slow things down, but not to derail things entirely. The second option we looked at, we called pulling the wheels off entirely. And that meant going above and beyond the damage that was inflicted under George W. Bush's administration. We did not look at a third scenario along the lines of things are going to get ever better on climate change, because there was no reason to believe from the year of campaigning that that would actually happen. And I think that's been borne out of by the evidence. So what did we actually begin to see? There's a couple of things that are obvious. I always use this issue of an iceberg, because there's certain things that are above the waterline that you can see, but sometimes the real damage is done by the things that cannot be seen under the waterline. So, for example, above the waterline, there were things like personnel. There's a statement in political science that personnel is policy. Whoever you put in to lead an administration or to lead an agency, that person will begin to shape policy through their dispensation, their disciplinary training, their ideology, and so forth. So very quickly, even as early as the transition team, we began to see the personnel occupying the new administration that were going to be very hostile to climate. For example, the person put in to manage the transition on the issue of climate was a gentleman called Myron Ebel, who has a very, very long track record of having his work funded by the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and the Koch brothers. He is not a credible scientist on this issue. He is a thinker who is paid to speak. And he was in charge of picking the people who would populate key administration agencies, such as the EPA, the Department of the Interior, and the Department of Energy. And as a consequence of that, you see, for example, former Governor Rick Perry in charge of the Department of Energy, a climate skeptic. You see Ryan Zinke in charge of the Department of Interior, a climate skeptic. And most of all, you see Scott Pruitt, who had built a career as the Attorney General of Oklahoma, with funding again from the Koch brothers, taking legal action against anything related to environmental protection, being put in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. So the personnel issues were quite substantial. You also see above the waterline the policy issues. You see, for example, immediate attempts to review and repeal the Clean Power Plan, to review and repeal the CAFE standards, which are very simply trying to put fuel efficiency standards into European automobiles, US automobiles, that are of a standard equivalent to other parts of the world. You also see financial incentives. The budget that is being submitted on a regular basis from the administration to Congress defunds action on climate change, domestically, globally, and of course defunds research, such as the research being carried out, for example, by NASA, that helps us understand the changing composition of the atmosphere. But more worrying are the things that you see going on below the waterline. And I am particularly worried, for example, about the shaping of the federal courts. Because the reality is, any action taken by the federal government on climate change is all dependent on executive authority held by the president, which in turn is dependent on a Supreme Court case from 2007 called Massachusetts versus EPA. And in this particular case, the Supreme Court ruled that greenhouse gas pollutants must be considered pollutants under the Clean Air Act, and that provided a mandate to the president to take action to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if President Trump and the people advising him on this issue begin and continue the process of repositioning the federal bench, particularly the Supreme Court, what we might have happen is not just this particular president refusing to act on climate change, but the tools that any president would need to use to act on climate change being taken away from the toolbox. It means that feasibly he could prevent any future president from being proactive on this particular issue, not just stalling action himself. And that is a dreadful outcome to anticipate in the absence of leadership from Congress. So that led us to finalize our scenario planning. And what you'll see from this particular scenario is that we're pretty confident for the most part that in the short term, decarbonization will not really be affected, because the reality is, in the real economy, decarbonization is happening. Fossil fuels, the highly polluting ones such as oil and coal, are being replaced by natural gas as a consequence of fracking and the price point of natural gas. And we're seeing an increasing use of renewable energy as a consequence of the price point of renewables and the availability of renewables. So in the real economy, we continue to see real growth separating from emissions and decarbonization moving ahead. Now, over the longer term, that might begin to fade as some of these more damaging policies are put into place and some of these more dangerous outcomes, such as the court system, could potentially begin to take effect. Similarly, on diplomacy, the same week as the election occurred, there was a gathering on international climate change in Morocco. And all of the other countries in the world came out in unison, led by the Chinese government, and they said in one voice, despite what happened in the US election, we remain absolute in our commitment to the Paris Agreement. So in the short term, there is no damage to the diplomacy. However, once you get to the medium and the long term, there begins to become some degree of cracks. First of all, many countries will struggle to implement their national climate action plans. And if they are struggling to implement, while at the same time seeing the United States get a free pass on this issue, it may prevent them from coming back on those 5-year cycles with increased ambition. And similarly, if the United States does not provide its fair share of climate finance to the international system, where is the incentive for the Europeans and the Chinese and others to give their fair share? So again, over the longer term, we see damage beginning to be done. The discourse is the real problem, because we already see damage done to discourse in the short term. We already see, for example, mention of climate change removed from federal government websites. We see federal government employees being told that they are not allowed to write or speak about this issue. We see people receiving federal government grants for their research being told they're not allowed to research on this issue. And just recently, one of the most prominent and respected international organizations in the world sent out guidance to their staff based in the United States, and that guidance says, if anyone asks you about climate change, don't answer the question, simply refer the audience to institutes, academics, and think tanks. So we are seeing an element of fear creeping into the system, where people are afraid to talk about this issue as it is because they're afraid of the repercussions, and that could do lasting damage. It took us very many decades to get to the point where we could present a consensus and build upon it. To now have a situation where that consensus is being undermined is very, very damaging. I'm not going to dwell on these next two slides. What I simply want to illustrate, and these slides are available for anybody who might want to have them, I'm happy to send them to you by email, is that one of the things we're told is that the rationale for pulling out of the Paris Agreement is that we want to save jobs, particularly those jobs in the coal sector. And I can tell you that I've spent time in West Virginia, and I completely understand the need to preserve the dignity of individuals who are working in this industry and to preserve a pathway to prosperity, to not only think of coal country as being a place where coal provides a livelihood, but to think of coal country as a place where the industry itself is wedded not only to cultural identity, but in many cases, the idea of masculinity. Coal helps me feed my family. If I don't have that, what am I? So there's sensitivities here that have to be really considered, and there are alternatives that need to be put in place for economic development. But the truth of the matter is that coal is a dying industry. It has been a dying industry for decades, and it will continue to be a dying industry because it simply is no longer competitive. It's no longer competitive because of the price point. It's no longer competitive because the cheap available coal has been used. It's no longer competitive in terms of jobs because more and more of those jobs are going to automation as opposed to real workers. And of course, it is extremely dangerous as a livelihood for individuals. But coupled with that is the fact that if you really, really wanted to think of this as a jobs issue, then you really would be thinking about jobs in energy efficiency, in energy conservation, in clean energy infrastructure, and in renewable energy, because that's where the new jobs are, and that's where the high-paid, highly skilled jobs are, the jobs of tomorrow. So this, again, myth that we are going to lose jobs as a consequence of this action could not be further from the truth. So now I want to present you with a more optimistic story as we begin to head towards conclusion. One of the things that I've noticed in the last 5 years and been part of is a change in mentality amongst the private sector. Those who had previously been hostile to this issue are now becoming some of its stronger advocates. And for the past 4 years, I was part of a coalition called We Mean Business, and the prime purpose was to try to mobilize the private sector to take action in themselves, to reduce their own emissions, to also advocate for public policy that would catalyze their ambition and lead to stronger decarbonization. And you can see on this slide some of the impacts of that work. First of all, we have close to 600 companies who together are worth in excess of $8 trillion who have taken on substantial climate commitments. These are commitments to purchase 100% of their energy from renewables, to put in place science-based targets, to put in place and advocate for carbon pricing, to remove deforestation from their supply chain, and so on and so forth. You'll also see close to 200 investors who together manage over $20 trillion of assets, making similar commitments, to think about risk from climate in their portfolios, and to provide guidance to the clients that they work with on how they might invest in a low-carbon future. The largest private sector employer in the world, which is also the largest employer in the state of New Hampshire, has committed to a science-based emissions reduction target, and that's Walmart. And Walmart did that not because they care about the environment exclusively, although that was part of the issue, but because the CEO of Walmart is convinced that his customer base is dying out, that he needs to replace that customer base with millennials, and that he needs to improve the relationship with millennials by improving the reputation of Walmart. And the success and the key to that success is to be progressive on issues such as the issue of climate change. So from a financial perspective, from an operational perspective, and also from a reputational perspective, more of these companies are moving in the direction of climate action. One of the important aspects of this slide that I also want to call your attention to is that when states began to sue the Clean Power Plan, or to sue the Obama administration about the Clean Power Plan, the 4 largest companies in the world by market capitalization at that particular time took the unprecedented step of submitting amicus briefs to the Supreme Court, saying that they supported the Clean Power Plan because it was essential to their business model to have access to affordable renewable energy. So you even see companies willing to get engaged in the judicial system in order to protect the transition to a low-carbon future. To give you a sense as to some of these companies and who they actually are, there's more than 300 companies around the world who've signed up to science-based emissions reductions targets. These are targets that are in line with the ambition of the Paris Agreement. And you'll see on this slide not only major brands that you'll be familiar with, but a cross-section of companies across a cross-section of industries. Healthcare companies, technology companies, food companies, consumer products companies. So you'll see that this is a mobilization that is happening irrespective of location and irrespective of sector. And similarly on this slide, you'll see a cross-section of companies that have committed to procure 100% of their energy from renewable sources. Now I want particular attention to be paid to this slide because of our need to change perspective to one where climate action is considered economic opportunity as opposed to common sacrifice and burden sharing. These companies are now making location decisions based on the availability of renewable energy. They have, for example, data centers in Alabama, and they're faced with a monopoly energy provider that will only give them access to fossil fuels. And so what's happening is Quebec is approaching them. And Quebec is saying, why don't you relocate to Quebec? Why don't you put those jobs in Quebec? And in return, we will give you all of the renewable energy you need in order to make your commitment real. And they're making those decisions to relocate based on that availability of renewable energy. So what I'm saying is New Hampshire and Vermont and other parts of New England can begin to seize upon an economic opportunity by branding yourself as a clean energy state and reaching out to these companies and offering them a deal. You no longer have to attract companies exclusively by providing them with tax breaks. You can now attract them in better ways by providing them with access to clean energy so that they can honor their commitments and bring their jobs here instead of, for example, going to Quebec. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that we're not satisfied with this level of corporate leadership. This is a dynamic situation, and we need to see leadership increasing all the time. And so I find this particular slide fascinating because it demonstrates who is the largest employer in every state of the Union. And you'll see that Walmart is the largest employer in 22 states of the Union, including in the state of New Hampshire. And so what Walmart needs to do as part of its ongoing leadership journey is now get from action to advocacy. How much of a game changer would it be if Walmart began to educate its own substantial workforce on the need for climate action? How much of a game changer would it be if Walmart began to educate its consumers about the need for climate action? Because the consumers at Walmart are not exclusively extreme left liberals. Walmart is one of those companies capable of reaching all of us irrespective of ideology. So one of the things I would like to see them begin to do is to now move from action to advocacy. Okay, we're now getting to the final part of the presentation, which deals with how you translate this to municipal action. The first thing that is important for any municipality or any company when embarking on the journey towards low-carbon climate resilience is to conduct a baseline. No two areas are the same. This is a global baseline for where our global greenhouse gas emissions come from. but different municipalities, different nations have a very different profile. I understand, for example, that in Portsmouth, your greenhouse gas emissions coming from transport as a sector are substantially larger. In other parts of the country, the greenhouse gas emissions coming from land use because of a predominantly rural economy will be substantially larger. The key is, as you embark on the journey to decarbonise, you have to understand what your starting point is, number one. And number two, it is far more effective to tackle all of the sectors than to simply put all of your eggs into one basket and only tackle one sector. The reason for that is because if you only address energy, you run the risk of trying to get too much ambition out of one sector, and you run the risk of alienating a constituency that might have a vested interest exclusively in energy. So the more you can reach out and tackle this in a systems approach, the more you can build ambition cumulatively by taking small wedges out of each sector, by bringing each sector along with you, and by making each sector feel that they are committing to what's called bold collective action. So understanding your baseline is important as a starting point, not only in terms of emissions reductions, but also in terms of developing a political strategy. The second thing that's really important to do is benchmarking, because what you need to do is you need to understand what others are doing on this issue so that you can learn from their best practice, but importantly because you want to learn from their worst practice and avoid their worst practice. There are examples all around the world, not only of climate policies that failed, but of climate policies that exacerbated the problem. So, for example, a number of years ago, I worked for the World Bank, and at the time, a piece of research was compiled and not published by the World Bank because it was vetoed by the US government at the time. But that particular piece of research said that 400 million additional people around the world had been plunged into abject poverty as a consequence of financial incentives going to the biofuel industry through subsidies in the European Union and the United States. So there was a period around about 2006 to 2008 when a lot of subsidies was going to the biofuel industry. The effect of that was to take land use away from food crop production and to put land use instead into the service of energy crop production. That had devastating consequences right around the world, and it is an example of how bad policy can have implications far beyond failing to address the problem. So we must benchmark to learn from good practice, but we must also benchmark because we do not want to have worst practice. If you're designing a carbon price, for example, you want to make absolutely sure that the burden of that carbon price does not disproportionately fall on low-income populations. So it's important to get the design elements right by learning from other examples. You must engage and mobilize. The process for how you go about building a climate strategy is often as important as the outcome itself, because there must be a process that invites the best ideas, but there must also be a process that secures the buy-in of the community, because this is an endeavor that is going to last multiple generations. And it is important that we do not continue to think of this as an endeavor for one political cycle, because the result of that is we make progress and then we fall back. The way to avoid that is to ensure buy-in and a degree of societal consensus through a sound process. There is an absolute need to collaborate. Collaborate means within government, across different departments, and it means across spheres of governance. One of the striking things that I learned today about what Portsmouth is doing is how much your action is going to be dependent on similar action in neighbouring municipalities and in the state. Again, particularly regarding issues such as transportation. So it's very important that you're not working on this issue in a silo or in a bubble, but that you can bring on board other municipalities to help with this endeavour, and that you can bring on board, of course, the private sector to collaborate with their innovation, their finance, their products and their services. It's very important to sequence the strategy. You don't want to start out with too little ambition, but you also don't want to start out with too much ambition and end up failing to implement. What I have found in my experience is that confidence and ambition comes from setting a target, meeting that target, and feeling that you therefore have the ability to go further faster next time around. So don't be afraid of putting in place a strategy that starts in a modest way, but that has an aspirational goal that allows you to test implementation, harvest lessons, and then go on. It's very important that we review and that we recommit, because we live in a dynamic world where new information is coming to us all the time. For example, today research was published that says the United States of America wastes 150,000 tons of food every day. That is the equivalent of 1 pound of food per person in the United States per day. And that's just in terms of our consumption. There's huge volumes of food waste also in the production and distribution of food. So we're learning new things all the time that should be used to recalibrate our climate strategies all the time. In addition to that, a strategy has to be able to interface with the real world. There is a great quote on strategy that comes from one of my favorite American philosophers. His name is Mike Tyson. And he famously said, everyone has a strategy until they're punched in the mouth. And what he meant by that was eventually your strategy comes into contact with the real world. And as a consequence of that, it needs to be dynamic, it needs to be constantly reviewed, it needs to be updated. What you also need to do is you need to begin thinking about a solution that is not just rooted in environment and climate. So, for example, if we want to tackle the issue of climate change, we've actually got to solve a major political problem in the United States. And that major political problem has many facets. But one of the facets is that the Republican tradition, which had very long been pioneers of environmental protection, whether through Theodore Roosevelt and the National Park System, or Richard Nixon and the EPA, or George Bush I and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That tradition of Republican leadership has disappeared, hopefully only momentarily. It needs to be rekindled. And in order for it to be rekindled, Democrats need to make a space for Republicans to walk into, and Republicans need to be willing to walk into that space. So we need to think about how we solve that issue. And as part of solving that issue, we need to think about how we solve a fundamental political problem in this country right now, which is that if you're an elected official, you don't have to be afraid of a general election. You have to be afraid of a primary because of the incumbency rate in Congress, which is 90%. That incumbency rate, this habit of redistricting, and this notion of fearing your primary more than your general election, prompts elected officials to go to extreme positions and prevents them from meeting in the middle on key societal issues like this. In addition, we have a campaign finance problem in the United States, which means you no longer have to fear your base, you have to fear your donors. And there is a very, very real problem in this country right now that a very small number of families with their wealth tied up in fossil fuels are having a disproportionate impact on the political system. Now, I'm raising that not to cause debate and division in the room, but to emphasize that you cannot solve this problem unless you're willing to look at the system in its entirety. The system is political, it's social, it's cultural, it rests on information and education, it relies upon a whole number of things beyond merely environmental policy or technology. And then the final things that I will leave you with are, first and foremost, there is a real need for us to begin to present a positive narrative on climate change. I am a card-carrying member of the environmental community and have been for over 2 decades. But we have fundamentally failed in our communication of this issue. We do not present this as opportunity. We do not present this as a better lifestyle. There is a huge difference between me standing in front of you this evening and saying, join me in a rescue mission for a doomed planet, or me saying to you, work with me to build a better, more inclusive, more prosperous world. We have got to begin to present the notion of climate action as a generational opportunity for growth, for development, for jobs, and not simply go around the world telling people the house is on fire, doom and gloom is approaching, we need to act now. Positive narratives are extremely important. And one of the things I've learned of late is what you call a problem is just as important as the substance of the problem. I happen to be Irish, and a number of years ago in Ireland, there was a referendum on what was initially called gay marriage. The term was changed from gay marriage to marriage equality, very deliberately, because gay marriage as a term suggested we were going to give additional rights to a proportion of the population that was entitled and that was asking for things they did not deserve above and beyond what everyone else was getting. And when you change the term to marriage equality, what opens up in people's minds is they're simply asking for the same entitlement that the rest of us hold. Fundamentally change the nature of the conversation. So the way we talk about this issue has to change, because we cannot go on only speaking to the converted. We have to persuade people. And you do not persuade people by labeling things the wrong way, and you do not persuade people by giving a negative narrative. In our own lives, there's 3 important things that we can do about this. This is the framework that I try to use also when I'm advising governments and countries. The first is act. There are many things you can do in your own life to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to build resilience. You can address your diet. You can address your use of transportation. You can address energy conservation and efficiency within your home. So take action. But don't stop at action. Think about how you might enable other people. If you're an individual, you might enable other people through your role as an educator. If you are a financial services company, you might enable other people by providing the right sorts of financial services, vehicles, and products that will enable people to invest in a low-carbon future. And then finally, think of what you do to influence. The 2 most important powers that we have are, first and foremost, the ability to vote and shape the political direction of our country and our communities. And the second important power we have is the power of the purse. You can decide to spend your money on high-carbon products and services or low-carbon products and services. If you spend it on low-carbon products and services, you will send a market signal that I promise you companies will respond to, and that will have an amplification effect throughout the whole economy. The reality is we are now at an important inflection point, and we have a very stark choice in front of us. We can either pursue a path that leads us towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient, and inclusive future, or we can proceed along a path that leads to heightened risk, greater inequality, and a conflict between human systems and natural boundaries. We have the power to act on this issue. I know there are many activists in this audience who are already acting. I strongly encourage you to continue your journey. I strongly encourage you to recruit more people to the journey. And with that, I will conclude and take any comments or questions. Thank you for your attention.
I like the commentary that you offer in terms of changing the conversation and thinking about the words that we use. One of the challenges that I foresee is that a lot of what I see in the American media these days is focused on negative stories, things that are wrong, things that are bad, things that we hate. And I'm wondering whether there have been any other experiences in other places around the world where they've been able to change some of that sort of media-driven mood, I guess I would say, around some of these topics.
So I would say that there are 2 issues that we need to think about with regards to the media. So let's deal with the one that you've raised first. I have seen examples of changing the conversation in other issue areas. And I think it's very important that we learn the lessons from these other issue areas. So for example, when I was growing up in Ireland, all of the media and advertisements and public information around smoking typically showed somebody dying of lung cancer in a hospital room and warned you that if you didn't stop smoking, eventually you would end up like that person. And it had absolutely no impact on the rate of smoking. And then all of a sudden somebody decided to change tack, and they produced a commercial that I remember seeing in the cinema. And that commercial showed a young woman going about her business. She went to school, she went to yoga, she went to her classes, she went out with her friends. And the final part of the commercial simply said, she's young, she's free, she doesn't smoke. And it simply presented not smoking as being a positive lifestyle choice, and it had a huge impact on the rate of smoking within the country. So I think there are examples like that. There are examples like what I described about gay marriage, for example, or marriage equality, that we should learn from and we should begin to incorporate into the climate conversation. Unfortunately, I don't see many examples of that around the globe on climate as an issue yet, but that doesn't mean that they're not there in other aspects of social change. The other thing that I think we need to change, however, when we're thinking about the media in the United States is that in other parts of the world, in part I think because there's a stronger history of public broadcasting, you don't find debate and division and denial on climate change when you turn on the television. You find the consensus being presented. And I think one of the big problems in the United States is the fact that too many people are getting their news from biased news sources. They're having their views on this particular issue reinforced, and they're not being exposed to new learning. And I don't blame the individuals for that. I blame the news sources for that. I recently gave a talk in Vermont, and the day after the talk, I got 5 emails independently from people. And each of them said that they had never been exposed to this information on climate change before, and that they were grateful for having been exposed to it. And they also went on to talk about their political choices and how they might make different choices on a later occasion. But what was very reassuring to me was the realization that if you do present people with the evidence, if you do present people with the truth, if they're exposed to that information, if you do it in a way that's sensitive, then people are willing to change their mind. But we've got to get to a point, I think, in this country where the Conservatives aren't just turning into Fox and the Liberals aren't just turning into MSNBC. You can only build public policy based on shared facts. You need an evidence base. You can then argue about the political approach to that evidence base, but you need an evidence base. And unfortunately, I think the news media, particularly the privately owned channels in the United States, are more interested in pandering and profits than they are in providing information, and that's got to change, I think. I see a hand here, and I don't see any other hands, so please.
This morning, I saw, thank you. This morning, I took away a great deal of meaning and a good story that you had from your bridge slide and what you did in Washington when you went the first time and had you change your approach from day to day. I think that would be helpful for me to see again, and others might enjoy it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for remembering. One of the stories I told today at the high school was that when I was first sent to the United States, I was sent to Washington, D.C. to represent the government of the Maldives, and my job was to go to Capitol Hill and to advocate for climate action. And I developed over time what I call a vocabulary of arguments. And the reason I developed that was because I first went to Capitol Hill and started to speak to people about polar bears and ice caps. And I found that a limited number of people would speak to me and everyone else would close their doors. And then I would go back the next day and I would talk about the implications for climate change on human rights. And suddenly a few more doors would open. And then I would go back the next day and I would talk about competitiveness, and a few more doors would open. And then the day after, I would go back and talk about national security and the fact that more US servicemen were being deployed overseas to deal with conflicts that were directly related to climate change. And it was in fact national security as an argument that prompted John McCain and Senator Warner from Virginia to sponsor the first resolution in the Senate dealing with climate change. And then I would go back the next day and I would talk about faith and stewardship of the land and what the Bible has to say about protecting our global commons. And what I was trying to reveal in that anecdote is that if we are to persuade people to lead on this issue, we cannot only talk about what excites us. We cannot only bring the story that brought us to this issue. The first thing we've got to do is we've got to listen to what other people care about. We've got to understand what the incentives of the people we're trying to persuade actually are. And we've got to learn to speak to those incentives. So I work, for example, with a variety of stakeholders, many of whom I do not agree with on a whole variety of issues. But it's not my job to be a purist. It's my job to understand the influence target, to understand their incentives, to speak to those incentives, and to persuade them to be better. So the anecdote that I was telling today and the message that I would share to you is a vital part of being a strong advocate on climate is being a listener, understanding those incentives and speaking back to them, and not only speaking to the issues that we care about and that excite us. So that was the anecdote. There's some hands up there too.
What a great presentation.
Thank you.
So, with regard to creating a positive conversation, I'm part of a group of people that are creating a conversation for solving climate change and have a preferred solution. One of the things that we've noticed is that it starts right here, right now, and your slides on business are very powerful. The question becomes, how do we translate that to the local businesses and small businesses? Those large companies, excuse me, I have a propensity to start lecturing and commenting. This is your show, not mine. So my question is, how might we speak now about solutions? And what signs do you see in the Congress that are of interest and are of encouragement, given that I think we'd agree that if we're going to get to emissions and impacting emissions, it's got to happen at the federal level. No matter what we do here, we're going to end up building resilience, yes? And that if we want to get to the heart of the matter.
So thank you for that question. The first thing that I would say is, unfortunately, when it comes to advocacy and persuasion, it always needs to be tailored. So, for example, I do a lot of media work, and the way I will speak to an Indian newspaper like The Hindu is very different to how I will speak to a German newspaper like Die Zeit, which is different to how I will speak to a Chinese television network like China Central Television, because there are different phrases that resonate with different audiences. So, for example, if you're speaking in India, you have to talk about equitable access to sustainable development. You can't only talk about emissions reductions, because in India, they have to deal with providing access to affordable energy to all. Similarly, if you're in China, the biggest issue that China was facing was how do you create 25 million jobs a year just to keep pace with population growth and new people coming into the employment market. So there's got to be a message in China about economic development. And when it comes to speaking to businesses, you've got to understand the business you're talking to. So if I go to speak to a food company like a Walmart or a Coca-Cola or a General Mills, I have to speak to them very specifically about the risks that they face in their supply chain. Coca-Cola is essentially a business concerned with water and sugar. So I have to be able to speak about how failure to tackle climate change is going to undermine their business model. Very different to if I go to speak to Morgan Stanley, where their whole business is about investments and growing portfolio and growing profits. I'm saying that because when you're talking to businesses in the local community, it's the same issue that I described when talking about the vocabulary of arguments. You've got to understand who the audience is, you've got to take the time to understand their incentives, and you've got to start speaking to those incentives. That, unfortunately, is a time-consuming process. It's not easy to do, but it is very, very important to do it, because failure to do it means that we will only attract the usual suspects, and the usual suspects are simply not sufficient to get the job done. So I think that's really important. And then with regard to your second comment, I would, in a sense, offer an amendment to what you said, in that I'm not convinced that we're only dependent on the federal government. I think, for example, that there is a great deal of activism at the state level in the United States. California, for example, has a 40% emissions reduction target, which, along with the European Union, is the most ambitious in the world. Because of the size of the California market, if they persist with what they plan to do on vehicle emissions, for example, it will certainly have an effect on the automotive industry, perhaps outweighing the effect of the reduction in CAFE standards. So I think there's an awful lot going on at the state level, and the more we see that, the better. It's particularly important that it happens in states that are controlled by Republicans. So I'm very pleased, for example, that the Republican governor of neighboring Vermont has set up a climate change commission. He is now putting in place various policies resulting from the recommendations of that commission. And more than anything else, I hope he becomes an advocate to his colleagues in the Republican Party, particularly in the Governors Association, and impresses upon people like Rick Scott of Florida that, in fact, you have to act on climate change, and it's probably not a good idea that you prevent people from using the term in meetings. When it comes to the actual Congress, unfortunately, I think there's a difference between politics and policy. So recently, I had the opportunity to advise some people who were briefing a high-ranking Republican who ran for president during the last electoral cycle. And this particular individual said, I would like to be briefed on climate change, but I insist it must only be people who come from my state. So a group of scientists from this person's state went in to brief him, and he peppered them with about 100 questions. And by the end of the meeting, they said to him, do you now get this issue? And he said, absolutely, I get this issue. And they said, well, are you now going to be an advocate for this issue? And he said, absolutely not. And they asked him why. And his exact phrasing was, I have no constituency on this issue. And he then moved beyond that. And he said, if I advocate for this issue, people to my left will call me a hypocrite for not having supported it from the outset. And people to my right will call me a traitor for abandoning the position of the party. And the phrase he used was, every time someone like me steps out on the branch, people like you shake the tree. Now, when I look at that particular individual, two things occur to me. The first is, I admire his political calculus, because I think he's actually quite correct in his political calculus. But I despair of his political cowardice, because in my view, an elected representative is there to show leadership and to promote a vision that a community should follow. and not just seek to get elected and parrot whatever he thinks his voters are going to vote for. So there's calculus and there's cowardice. But the reason why he holds that position is, I think, because it has become an orthodox position in the Republican Party to be a climate denier, and in the Democratic Party, it's too convenient for Democrats to say climate is our issue and we're not allowing the Republicans in on it. And so the responsibility falls on both sides. We've got to allow space for Republicans to move in, and Republicans have got to want to move into that space. Until that happens, and as long as the electoral system continues to propagate this idea of being primaried rather than losing a general election, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to make progress in Congress, and that means, unfortunately, that I think more of the leadership needs to come from states. I see hands up here at the back of the room. I'm sorry, I can't really see your hands because of the spotlight, so feel free to shout out.
Make it short? Okay. First of all, I just want to, Peter knows me, I guess. I want to thank you also. This is really stimulating, and Peter just told me about it, so I just found out this evening. But I think your last slide right there is, speaks to me, and just want to share that I recently, within the last year, had the opportunity to swim in the ocean and bumped into a toothpaste tube, bumped into plastic on the bottom of the ocean as I got out, and floating in suspension. And I think after that experience, I'm more passionate than I even was before that I will never again consume a plastic, use a plastic bottle to consume something. And I just encourage all of us to think about opportunities that we have to avoid that, and be the advocates that we can all be. Second thing is, I just bought a Chevy Bolt, which is B with a Chevy Bolt with a B, not a V with a volt. It's a 100% electric car. I've been doing a lot of research. If anybody is exploring this whole area, I think it's a great way to act. It's the most fun car I've ever owned. It's an American-made car. And the other thing I think we can do, because it's so hard to know as individuals what to do, is move our money. And where do you invest your money? Because it's one of the things that even if we have a savings account at a bank, New Hampshire has a community loan fund, which is a wonderful social change vehicle. So I think it's really incumbent upon us to make individual decisions. Oh, Peter's pulling the mic.
But superb comments. Thank you for those comments. I see a hand up over here.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you can give us the name of maybe another city the size of Portsmouth or bigger or smaller around here or anywhere in the U.S. who would be slightly ahead of us in following the steps of the Paris Agreement. Is there some other place we can look up to?
I'm afraid I can't give you a specific name because I don't know enough about Portsmouth, but what I would say is there's a website called Low Carbon USA, and that particular website has an inventory of companies, cities, and states who have pledged to continue with the Paris commitment. You'll be able to see that inventory, and some of the names of the cities or municipalities might strike you as being within your peer group. But
And you can actually see what they've done?
well, no, you would be able to see the name of the city, for example. Then you would probably need to go to the website of the city itself to get an idea of some of the work that they've done. An alternative would be to go to the website of an organization called C40. They typically deal with much larger cities. So I think Portsmouth is about, 22,000 inhabitants. C40 will be dealing with cities that run into the millions. So that won't be of a similar scale. But on that particular website, there's information on what they're tangibly doing. And then there's an organization called ICLE, the International Council of Local Environmental Initiatives. They cover all manner of municipalities, large and small, around the world, and they would certainly have case studies as to what different municipalities are doing on this issue that you could look at. But again, I just wouldn't know which city to refer you as being within your peer group, I'm afraid.
Doctor, can you repeat the first one again, please?
Yes, the first one is called Low Carbon USA. The second one is called C40, and the third one is called ICLE. ICLEI, International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, ICLE.
Hi.
Yes.
I'm a little nervous about sharing this, but this past summer, I went back to Eastern Kentucky to visit with some families that I had worked with in the late 60s in 2 coal mining communities. And I went back because I feel very honored that over all the years that several of the families have stayed in touch with me. And the women were in their late 90s, so I thought I'd better go back and say hello to them. And it was a really rough time because in that time, men had black lung disease and cancer and stuff, and our job was to get them to speak up. We were like organizers at that time to get them to speak up and ask for health benefits, and the poverty at the time was extreme. So I went back, and yes, there were changes. The roads were paved, and things had, the schools were better. There was maybe now 1 supermarket within a 30-mile range. But many of the folks had voted for Trump. And I did not get into the conversation as to, I just said, well, what were you thinking and stuff without, I knew what they were thinking. They thought he was going to open up the mines. And that's not going to happen. That's a story in itself, that it was very heart-wrenching to be there and experience that. But what I just found out recently was what I guess Mr. Trump is negotiating is opening up a for-profit prison in an area where several coal mines had been shut down. And that in itself is, in my opinion, disgusting. But the other thing that was interesting were that on the hollers, you'd go down through the hollers where all the homes were, behind the houses, most of that land had been stripped, that they went from deep mining to strip mining. The folks know it's mountaintop removal. And people were given a small amount of money, the families, for the mineral rights to their land. And so there were new houses, very simple little houses that were still there. I mean, I just could go on, but it was heart-wrenching how many people voted for Trump. And I remember, having to spend some time dealing with that, the anger and frustration that I felt, that they believed that he was going to change their lives again, and that's not going to happen.
Well, just to comment on that, I happened to have a very good experience last year. I spent 10 days in West Virginia, in Welch, which is in McLean County, and is the highest voting for Trump county in the nation in the 2016 election. And anybody who's ever seen the photographs or videos of Robert Kennedy touring Appalachia in the late 1960s would be, I think, appalled and surprised to go to these communities and find that so little has changed in the intervening time. Welch is a place that is, for example, a food desert. There's no fresh produce, and the major source of food in the area is a local food bank that provides foodstuffs from cans and things like potato chips to the local population. I happened to stay with an individual who was 23 years old, had 3 children of his own, was a high school dropout, and had just adopted his sister's 3 children because his sister and her partner are now in jail for opioid addiction. So this is a young man with no education who's now caring for 6 children. And you can imagine what a struggle that would be for any person, but particularly for this individual and his income and his educational level, it's going to be extremely difficult. And this is a community that is riven with social problems and economic problems. And it is a community that is legitimately clinging to coal because that has been historically the source of prosperity. And it is a community that unfortunately is being lied to. But it's also a community where it could, in my view, be redeveloped if we had a little bit of imagination and a little bit of creativity. So right now, for example, there's a bidding war going on for where Amazon's second headquarters should be. And in addition to that, there are US soldiers situated all over the world. There's 50,000 US soldiers situated in Korea right now who will never be sent to battle because any battle that happens over the demilitarized zone in Korea will not involve ground forces. And there's US troops stationed in Japan that will never go to war. And there's US troops stationed in Germany that will never go to war. So why not come up with a creative solution? Why not have a military base in West Virginia, repopulate that community with repatriated US soldiers, put them on a military base there that is close enough to Norfolk, Virginia that they can be deployed quickly, close enough to Andrews Air Force Base so that they can be deployed quickly, move in Amazon's headquarters maybe 2 hours up the road so it's closer to the Ohio or Kentucky border, and create an economic zone of development that is based on a new economy, But instead of doing that, what we have is a president who has no interest in those communities. What he has an interest in is getting those communities to vote for him. And my fear, and I'm not talking about the coal country here, I'm talking about a different constituency, is that when you promise things to people and you don't deliver, and they're already disillusioned, what do they do the next time around? And we see, for example, in parts of Eastern Europe, people who have become disillusioned taking extreme measures in terms of who they vote next time and the time after that and the time after that. So my fear is that we're actually only at the beginning of this process, because next time around, the promises that have been made will not have been honored, and my fear is, well, where will those people go with their votes the next time around? Yes.
Hi. You talked eloquently about the need to listen to and persuade people who think about things differently than us, which I agree is essential. And it's also hard for many of us to do, especially when we disagree so strongly with people. It seems like you've been successful at it to some extent, and I wonder if you have any thoughts for us on how to do that effectively.
So I wouldn't want to take credit for being successful at it, because I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think it is a very, very difficult balancing act. When I say be willing to listen to other people, I'm not suggesting for a single second that we should tolerate or pander. I personally refuse to do that. So I'm not the type of person who will sit and avoid a conversation simply because I'm afraid that that conversation might cause offense. That's possibly a consequence of my education and possibly a consequence of my culture. There is no subject that is taboo. And if you and I have a debate over a drink, I will forcefully disagree with you and not just stay silent. But I do believe that it's very important to understand what it is that motivates people and not just listen to what they are saying. And a number of things can be done to do that. I think first and foremost, changing the dynamic of meetings is really important. I learned a long time ago that diplomats are sent overseas to talk for their country, but they're not sent overseas to listen for their country. And I saw this very tangibly in dinners that I used to organize for diplomats, where somebody would come, for example, from the US government, with a prepared set of speaking points. They would present those speaking points, and when they were finished speaking, they would start reading from their BlackBerry, and they wouldn't even listen to the response. So the first thing I did was I changed the dynamic of the meeting, and I said people are no longer in here as representatives of their government. They're no longer allowed to bring in speaking points. They're going to have an off-the-record private conversation as individuals, and I found that that actually got us to creative dialogue and conversation. That when people knew they weren't going to be reported, that there was no attribution, when they knew that they didn't have to represent their government, they were actually willing to listen and to converse and not just present a viewpoint. There's also a second model that I've seen that's been quite effective. This is something pioneered by the Red Cross, and it's something called gamification. And it's where, for example, we would gather a group like this together, and instead of me lecturing you from a stage, we would play a variety of games together. And that would help you to absorb information and absorb the content as a full person and not just intellectually. And I've seen that work to great effect in all manner of different countries and different venues, sometimes in international organizations, and sometimes in communities in developing countries where there's no literacy, so they wouldn't be able to understand the printed material if we were to hand it. They I think, are the things that I would think about more than anything else. But I really do believe it's a combination of being unafraid to talk about issues, and at the same time being respectful of other people's opinion. Part of the training that I received when I earned my PhD was I learned from a philosopher called Amartya Sen. And one of the important teachings of Amartya Sen is that all viewpoints are both legitimate and contestable. And that, to me, is a very important statement, because by saying it's legitimate, you're allowing someone to voice an opinion that might not be palatable, that might cause offense, but you're giving them the freedom to say that. You're not delegitimizing them in advance. But by saying it's contestable, you're also saying to them, if you say something that I disagree with, I'm going to come back at you hard in that disagreement, and I'm going to come back to you with facts, and you better be prepared to deal with those facts. So I think that that is a theory of conversation that I have found very, very helpful in my work. But I don't want to suggest that there's any easy answers. I don't think there are, and especially in a country that I think has become tribal, it's very, very hard. There was a recent article that I read that said one of the problems in this country is that it's very difficult to admit that you are wrong, but it's even more difficult to admit that your opponent is right. Very, very interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, but it's not just saying I am wrong. It's about saying someone that you disagree with, that you find completely have disdain for them. It's admitting that they were right all along, and that's a really, really difficult journey for people to make. So in a sense, I think it's about creating safe spaces for people to disagree.
I've only got one more question in there. I think we've got time for one more question.
Thank you, and thank you, PS21. Can you help me understand how to open this to Republicans? I am absolutely stuck on that.
So last year I was actually asked to develop a strategy that was primarily aimed at reaching out to conservatives, whether Republican or non-affiliated. And we came to a number of conclusions. The first conclusion we came to was the messenger is critically important. So we have a history in the business of persuasion of thinking that the prime person is the influence target, i.e. the politician you're seeking to advocate in front of. But this work revealed that actually the influence champion is equally important. So for example, when people were trying initially during the transition phase to influence President Trump, there was a lot of effort put into getting to Jared Kushner and getting to Ivanka, because the feeling was they are influence champions. They might be able to sway his opinion on these matters. When it comes to Republicans, particularly elected officials in Congress, what we did was we focused on the money. We focused on the companies who are the dominant employers in the districts that Republicans were representing, Republicans that we thought were movable. So in the Senate, for example, we thought that Lindsey Graham was movable. We thought that Susan Collins was movable. We thought that John McCain was movable. And Marco Rubio was movable. So there was a variety of 6 or 7 senators, and then maybe upwards of about 30 Republican House representatives. We found out who are the dominant employers in their constituencies. Are those dominant employers working on climate change? Are they, for example, like Walmart? Would they be willing to go in and speak to those representatives and say, this is a key issue for us as employers in your district, we need you to take a leadership role in this? We also looked at who were the dominant corporate campaign finance contributors to these individuals, to see if any of them were affiliated with some of these companies, and again, to see if they were movable. And we looked for who the individuals were who were most contributing most of the campaign finance. So the first thing we thought was, who are the influence champions? And we thought about how could you use those influence champions? Was it about the money? Was it about electoral power, etc.? The second thing that we came to in terms of a conclusion was that we needed to change the nature of the conversation. So instead of talking about environment and climate, we needed to talk about jobs, and we needed to talk about economic development, and we needed to talk about something called the just transition. The fact that many communities have been disproportionately impacted by globalization, have suffered enormous economic dislocation, and that we must care for those communities as we transition to a low-carbon economy. So we began to think of how can we create an evidence base that would enable us to speak to those communities, and through those communities speak to the elected Republicans. And then the other issue that we came to was the issue of faith, and how we could mobilize more people, particularly in the evangelical community, who would be willing to speak out on this issue and perhaps carry some Republicans along with them. This particular strategy is very much in its infancy. I think there's much more needed in this strategy. I think we have to address the media as part of it. I think we do have to address the fact that this is becoming entrenched and tribal. But I think that those elements that I've just mentioned are the beginnings of the strategy. I don't suggest for a second that they're the end of the strategy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cameron.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you all so much for coming out this evening. We really appreciate it. And thank you again to our sponsors who made this evening possible. If you go to our website, ps21.info, we have an opportunity where you can donate to help sponsor additional events like this and great speakers like Dr. Cameron. And also, we will have a video available probably in around a week or so that will be posted to the website, so you can go back, watch the talk again, review the slides, but we will make that available. And all of our previous events, we video just about all of our events, and those are all also available on the website, ps21.info. And again, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well for announcements and sign up for our newsletter.
Can I also just say my email is on the screen, so if anybody would like these slides to use in however you want to use them at any meeting you might attend, please feel free to drop me an email. I'm happy to provide you with the slides. I'm also happy to answer any questions that you might want to ask me via email.
Thank you so much. Thank you.